Hi, welcome to the 5th Labour History Talk. We've just had a problem with the video, so we're trying to record voice on a phone. I've thanked my co-learners. I've warned people that history is the art of being wrong in front of other people to get it right. And so this week we're dealing with the harvester wage determination and its discontents, looking particularly at wage determination, inflation and housework from 1900 through to about 1960, 1970, 1980, but the critical point is earlier on in the period, 1900 to 1920. I started with the idea of what is work, and I'm following Marx here on wage labourers in production and non-productive areas, and them being paid a wage in exchange for their capacity to the capitalists to use their labour power. And this leads on to what is a wage. And Marx is really interesting in Capital here because he says that a wage is the cost of reproducing labour, which is not necessarily the same as the cost of keeping the labourer and their family alive. So we know of cases where wages have gone below the starvation line in Ireland, and I think that there are useful ways to talk about the wage-labour relationship even when the wage isn't paid directly in cash. So people have been paid in goods. Even in Auschwitz there was basically a market in labour because the Nazis couldn't even get people threatened with death to work unless cigarettes and nicer shoes and nicer clothing was available in a trading system. Part of the cost of reproducing labour for Marx is the idea of the cost of reproducing free labourers on the market. So the labourer spends the entirety of their wage in Marx's theoretical description in Capital on the commodities that produce them. Marx, though, is here talking in a very limited way. He's not talking about actual families or historical concrete situations. He's trying to get at the laws of motion of capital. And I think he gets at them good, but I also think that it's worth considering that working class households have relied on black and grey market behaviours and reproducing themselves by selling domestic services directly and by the housework involved in reproducing the household. Wages for housework, which I'm going to bring up, is a demand that came out of the 60s and 70s from Selma James and Maria Rosa Della Cosa in their book The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community. It's very interesting, and when they were making the demand, they were not making the demand as in really seriously pay us this in capitalism. They were making the demand in the broader sense. This is the biggest demand we can make to push as far as we can politically, and people recognise it. And it's not worth attacking them over the ludicrousness of this demand because workers have repeatedly made ludicrous demands about wages. They've demanded a family wage in capitalism. I don't know any family that would like to consume less than it actually does, which is normally what Make Your Wage bargain does to you, and which hasn't wanted to consume or work less or have a nicer form of work and consumption than it does. Similarly with ideas of total wages or social wages. A social wage is a concept going around where the government pays part of your wage in direct services, like superannuation, which most of us will never touch, which is a pension that we pay for, like free primary, secondary or higher education or further education or technical education, like broadly free health systems. People argue that these are a social wage, and often people want this social wage expanded. But it isn't that one-to-one deal between worker and employer that Marx is talking about. But people do treat it kind of like a wage in reality, but they don't. So already we've got more complex with the demands and the ways of living that workers actually have than Marx explores in his limited, 3,000 pages, but a man only has so much life to write in, work capital. And Marx was aware and acknowledged this, and it was part of his method to get through to the laws of motion, not to the actual concrete nature of every single instance of capitalism ever, anywhere, anywhen. So I want to talk about the working class family structure before the harvester judgment. As we saw last week and the week before, workers lived primarily in what amounted to nuclear families and closed off more and more into nuclear families as more and more freedom to have alternate family relationships degraded. So I'm going to give perhaps an exemplar household. This exemplar household has a male breadwinner who's viewed as unskilled, and he's called a breadwinner in this day and age, a female partner working between a sixth and a third of his income and doing most of the housework, 2 children above the age of 12, so generally able to labour in this society, most of whose wages gets taken up by the household. 1 child under 12, or half child or no child under 12, who generally wasn't as waged or had less access to wage labour, and a lodger or 2. And this made up the family that people reproduced themselves in. And to give you an idea of this structure, I'm going to talk a little bit about cash money figures for this group. So we're talking about men on 6 shillings a day. Now, a shilling is kind of the equivalent, before considering inflation, of about 10 cents. But I'm going to talk about it mostly in terms of shillings, because everybody was paid in shillings, and I'll give a comparison from 1965 later on in shillings. And we'll start talking about what inflation does to the real wages of people. So a carpenter or a bank teller, as a man, was on 10 shillings a day. An unskilled man was on 6 shillings a day. A housemaid was on 2 shillings a day. A cook was on 4 shillings and 6 pence a day. Now, 12 pence makes up a shilling, and 20 shillings makes up a pound. I'm going to repeat this every time I do complex conversions. So she was on 4.5 shillings a day, the cook. Boys were on about 6 pence a day, so half a shilling, for a 12-hour day, 6 days a week. Night shift. When we think about the structure of junior wages today in something like Kmart, we need to think about the presence of all these cheats. Children are worth less than a man, women are worth less than a man. But the household relied on 4 members of the household making wages, plus 2 lodgers paying rent in a terrace, if not 2 families living in half terraces. Eggs were 1 shilling and a quarter each. So if a man eats 2 eggs for breakfast, he has eaten a third, more than a third of his day's wages. Let alone the wife eating eggs, let alone the children eating eggs. And you often see a household where the father brutalises the wife and the children and eats more at the table than anybody else. And the lodgers eat like him, but no other member of his immediate family eats like him. You see situations where adult children earning an adult woman's wage are sleeping on the verandas of terraces, having to walk through their parents' bedroom, if it isn't their parents' and their children's bedroom. Harvester was a massive combine harvester plant, occupying 75 acres in Melbourne, in the beautifully named suburb of Sunshine. Now, if you've gone out to Sunshine, you'll know how much sunshine you'll see in Sunshine in a year. Not that much. Sunshine is also in the far west of Melbourne, so it was new construction, and combine harvesters were some of the most highly advanced mechanical equipment of the day and age. So this is a high productive new industry. It has skilled labourers, it has unskilled labourers, it has women labourers, it has junior labourers. It occupies the full spread of labour. Now, when they introduced federation, part of the deal was the idea that there would be fair wages for British workers. And as we discussed in previous weeks, this was largely a boss's deal that the working class had to accommodate to, whether we liked it or not, because our revolutionary strikes in the 1880s didn't go as far as we'd like them to go. Part of the deal was employers could be fined by being treated as overseas importers if they didn't pay fair wages, and the Commonwealth Government established a court of arbitration to establish what fair wages would be, and also to cut the nuts off the new unskilled workers unions. Harvester was overseen by Higgins, a judge, and Higgins said the fair rates of wage for an adult unskilled male will be 7 shillings a day. So this was about a 25% pay increase all round. How they figured this out was they got women to send in accounts of their household to the harvester hearing down at the detailed level of every single thing they spent in that week. So the judge could determine what was frugal comfort for a man, his wife and their 2.5 children. Any more than 2.5 children is of course a luxury. So part of what the harvester decision is a decision about what the appropriate structure of a working class household is in the ideal sense. A working man, a non-working woman, and 2.5 children in various stages of access to the labour market. Working 5.5-day weeks and I think part of the Harvester decision set, because this is decisions over 15 years before it gets Australia-wide coverage for all the workers it's going to cover pretty much, reduces that to about 8-hour days of actual performed labour. Pretty sure that's when we actually win the generalised 8-hour day. So that's the Harvester decision broadly. It gets knocked over in the High Court because the High Court rules the government doesn't have the power to set fines on employers. But the Arbitration Commission finds another power on which to rule this and basically rules it into law over the next 15 years for more or less every worker in Australia. So already, and Raylene Francis's paper, which I have somewhere here, 100 Years of Women's Wage Fixing, published 2000 in the Journal of Interdisciplinary Gender Studies, talks about the history of approaches to arbitration as being centred on the experience of the male wage earner. There has been a lot of criticism since the 1970s of this picture of arbitration, and I'm mostly viewing it through a lens that has come after these studies. I think it's really interesting. I did some calculations on this based on the 5.5-day week and on the kind of family I was talking about earlier, based over the entire expectable working lives of the family. Because part of the structure of the household is most working women were kicked out of their jobs soon after marriage or pregnancy and were then forced into partial jobs that were less good. So what I've dealt with here is a calculation. Okay, workers in British cultures non-Irish have tended to delay family making until they can afford one. So family making happens earlier in Australia where wages are viewed to be higher by the working class than in England. But generally, we're talking about between 20 and 30. Irish would have married earlier, but it depends person to person. And this is one of the big points I'm going to make through this process, that a lot of the stats I'm talking about are averaged out to the point of uselessness, except for actual class struggle. Either to lie to the courts, because any stuff in this area is going to be a lie. We can't average all men in Australia out any more than we can average human beings in general. And secondly, that as a motivator, we won 1 shilling. We're underpaid by this much. But I don't think we should view this as true. I think we should view it as ideological. So the family I talked about before, a man, a wife and 2.5 children in frugal comfort, 5.5 male days over 50 years. The man would have earned prior to that as a boy. 2.25 male days for a woman over 20 years, which is the half rate. Women were established as half a man in Harvester. 1 male child day per week for 6 years, 1 male child per week day for 6 years, and half a child male for 6 years. And 6 is on the, which, then I worked out the total number of labour hours being put in, the actual used human time, priced that at the male rate, and calculated the value of the proportion of the male wage given to him for the domestic work of the woman and the children. Now, this is very abstract, but it amounts out to about 3 shilling 9.5 pence, so 3 3/4 shillings for the wages paid per day into the household in respect of the hours that should have been paid to the other members of the household if they'd been paid at the male unskilled rate. So I think we can say that about half of the man's income was paid to him to keep a family, i.e. the cost of housework viewed by the courts was about half of the wage given to a man. That the standard labourer was the woman, and the male was then given half a wage again, because the court viewed these as individuated workers, not as workers in a family. So the woman's wages were not taken into account in setting a fair basic wage for the unskilled worker. So I think that if we view about half of the wage paid to the man as a wage paid to keep a woman and 2.5 children. Now, men could have the choice not to have a woman and 2.5 children, and the argument here is this would be the cost of hiring an equivalent service of a woman. The actual fact is that you couldn't support as a single mother on the 50% of male wage that she would have been earning rent plus 2 children. Which means, more or less, that we're looking at a forced nuclear family situation. Now, I think it's worth considering that because the state's conception here, Higgins was heavily influenced by the Catholic Church's call for a decent family wage to keep a family within, that Higgins was taking account of the productive powers of the household in general. So I think it's worth considering that wages were paid in for housework in Australia up to the 1960s, but they were paid to the male breadwinner of the household. The women did the work, the man got the pay, the man then had to keep the woman and children. Now, this doesn't fit neatly into Marx's categories, and I don't think Marx would argue that his categories were meant to deal with this kind of situation. Marx's categories were meant to deal with the laws of motion of capital as a total system. But it forces Australian workers out of their mateship, which also included homosexual and homophile relationships, forced them out of unmarried work into more married work situations. But it also immediately puts on the table for women workers equal pay. Because if they were paid at the male rate, the family would be a lot better off, even on unskilled wages. Now, the other concomitant here is the Harvester judgment deals with unskilled labour. How do we pay for skilled labour? Now, in the old days before Harvester, skilled labour like the carpenters turned up on the job site and said, "Fuck you, we're on strike." The system of national awards and labour arbitration was meant to stop these kind of enterprise bargaining strikes, which could threaten militancy and restrict them. So the courts wanted to figure out a way to pay skilled workers. The way they did this eventually was through a similar hearing process of details of labour processes and judging how much that skill was worth. Now, the Harvester decision for the basic wage was a combination of the employer's ability to pay, even though Harvester at the time said capacity to pay by the individual employer is not critical. Later judgments in the 1930s rolled this back during the Depression under the ability to pay argument. So on the one side, what it takes to keep a family alive, and on the other side, the employer's capacity to pay. With skilled labour, what happened was a system of margins through industry-specific awards for different kinds of skilled work. So if you're a carpenter, as of Harvester, your margin is 3 shillings a day on top of unskilled. And you'd get these in detailed awards, and people would go back to the court and say, "You last judged our skill structure in 1915. Our skill structure has changed so much since 1915. We do different work differently now. You have to reevaluate our skill structure." And out would come all the labour process stuff under a good judge. Under a bad judge, they'd just be arbitrary, and they'd go through it all again. But the skill structure was based on the concept of male skill. And I believe the last time we overturned this kind of stuff was most recently in the social workers case, where they argued that their skill was undervalued because it was viewed as feminised. But before that, the chief case was the 2002 started hearing in the 1990s, librarian's case. Now, a librarian isn't a shelf stacker. She isn't somebody on the hot desk. She is somebody who judges what a library should collect. We're talking the kind of professional skills that you see in lawyering, in professional engineering, major long-term decision-making. And part of the feminisation of library work in Australia goes back to State Library New South Wales, where they decided to feminise it because middle-class women were cheaper. So you see a lot of this stuff, and gender becomes a wedge in the class over the wage issue. What's the response here? I better talk about some other stuff. We've talked about the actual structure, but we also need to remember that because a lot of these workers were day labourers, that they took St Monday off because they worked a 5.5-day week and half a Saturday wasn't enough, so people didn't turn up on Monday and lost 7 shillings for that. So the actual structure of working class work isn't one breadwinner and a stay-at-home wife, even though many people wanted that, and the more skilled you get and the higher your margin, the more you do it, or even if you're off into white collars. They also took St Monday off, and this is why the averaging shit is such a lie. It's still worth looking at to talk about on the whole have we won and lost, but it's also a lie in these ways. The harvester household was more nuclear. It was more dependent on it was more dependent on the male breadwinner than the previous household. More women were kicked out of factories as skilled men went, we don't want women if they're half rate. We want to keep our skill margin and our basic. We don't want to be diluted. And then you get factory agreements to kick women out of factories, except in a few industries where they were earning near male wages to begin with. And then you get an industry where men and women earn similar skilled wages, still not great. So as of 1919, women were earning about 54% of a man on average. And the argument starts to become equal pay. And Ray Francis has another great paper whose name I've forgotten, and another brilliant historian who works on the Female Confectioners Union talk about their struggles to get the courts to recognise that the cost of keeping a woman alive was much more than 50%. And these go into even nastier details because the courts police women's expenses much more than they police a male breadwinner's household expenses. And so, you know, do you spend any money on beer at all? No. Well, I'm ruling that out. You shouldn't be spending money on beer. That isn't part of a frugal, modest living. Skilled workers, of course, weren't allowed to just frugally subside. They subsided on a margin above frugality. It's also worth saying now who this system didn't cover. It didn't cover Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Didn't cover grey and black market workers like sex workers. It didn't cover a bunch of white-collar workers and professionals, some of whom were actually working class at this time. So it didn't cover male or female primary school teachers as of 1922 with the teachers' case, which explicitly ruled them out as not being an industry. In New South Wales, they won industrial status in the state courts a lot earlier, but in New South Wales there was a much stronger labour movement and a labour movement in Parliament that could be pushed by the labour movement in general. And that was only overturned in the 1980s, I believe. Might have been the social workers again. So the concept of ruling out non-industrial occupations took 60, 70 years to be gotten rid of by the labour movement. So 1919, women start getting their own industry cases before the courts, and the courts aren't very nice to them. What you see is that by 1950, women were earning 75% of the male rate, and by the time of... Now, and also note, in 1958, there was a New South Wales Female Rates Act in New South Wales, but nationally you're talking about 69, where the court rules that equal wages for work of equal value must be paid, which only covers 18% of women. And by 1972, a much broader ruling is present. But as I've said, it's still going on. Like the childcare case recently was one. There are still unwon aspects of equal wage, but the big wins were 1969, 1972. Strange, that period of labour movement activity and mobilisation. How did you get there? Well, you got there through labour movement women fighting from 1907 onwards for it. You got there through communist and labourist women fighting for it. You got there through the attempts of the labour movement to bring in middle-class women proper and white-collar women proper into the deal. You got there through strong white-collar unions in feminised sectors like nursing. But at the same time, you see this change where... So the basic wage is the critical part here. You see the basic wage frozen in the 1950s. Over the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s, the basic wage didn't increase as rapidly in value terms, i.e. in Karl Marx's concept of value, which goes back to the number of socially necessary labour hours in a society, not to the cash values. And I'll give you stats on this that we can all understand. So it'll be fairly easy. It's like the egg, you know. 2 eggs for breakfast, 2/3 of the day's wage gone. That kind of deal. But to get there, we need to talk about inflation. So while women are fighting for equal wages through social movements, and the union movements were backing them, and I just realised we're at 24 minutes, the working class movement was fighting to keep its wage levels up. And this is a really simple description of what kind of difference is made when you don't fight to win wages against the boss. In 1939, the average white-collar worker was earning, 1937, the average white-collar worker was earning 3 times that of the average blue-collar worker. By 1960, that margin of skill had decreased to about 10%. So white-collar skills, because they weren't industrially unionised, because they didn't fight for awards as much, they started fighting in the 1950s, was reduced from 3 times to 10%. Think about what happened to the skilled worker blue-collar margin and to the basic wage itself over that period. Now, that white-collar example was in dollar terms, or rather in pound terms, not in value terms. Think about the speed up that happened over the 20th century. And now let me put the last thing before I go into a very, very quick stats session for you. Think about what happened in value terms over the 20th century and what happened in hours of household labour conducted by workers over the 20th century. In 1907, Higgins said that frugal comfort in the standards of the day, which is what we care about in value terms, because we know you can pay workers less than starvation. In value terms, frugal comfort for 2.5 people, one of them working under this capitalist judgment. If you look around you, frugal comfort today means 2 adults working. So the number of labour hours the capitalists have extracted out of the household over the lifetime of the labourers in that household has increased by quite a lot. I don't know what... I don't have the numbers in my head, but we're looking at what was meant to be 100% of a male worker wage to support the household and 0% of a male worker who was female. And I say that because the equal wage judgments are based on the idea of normal masculinity, which is the argument the librarians made, and well done to them. Anything that gets our wages up is great. So from half of the adults meant to work in the household to survive in frugal comfort to both adults having to work in the household to survive in frugal comfort. We've lost 50% of what the capitalist class viewed as what we should not be working. And we've only got a half-day Saturday and an 8-hour day. Now, just to talk a bit more briefly about housework, at the same time we've seen elements of what was housework in the past moved out of the household and turned into commodities. Social work, child rearing, child raising after school, schools to 18, schools to fucking 22 with the universities. Nursing. People used to not have the expectation of medical treatment being socially provided. Now, some of these things we pay for, some of these things we don't pay for cash in hand. So I'd like to bring up the issue of the social wage in relation to the household wage and the conversion of non-commodities into commodities as well. But to give you some boring stats, I would like to reference 2 things. One is the Australian Bureau of Statistics 13010, and there will be links in future, which contains both stats on long-term consumer price indexes and wage indexes, and I lost the stat to get the figure. This talks about the cost of living over 100 years. In 1907, the consumer price index equivalent was 48. In 1920 it was 100, then it went back to 80 during the depression of the 1920s and the 1930s, which we will talk about in a fortnight. Then it went back up to 100 by the war years, then 200 by 1953, then 300 by 1969, then 1,000 by 1982, and then 3,000 in 1911. The cost of living has increased from 50 to 3,000 in that period of time. And that's if the cost of living is fairly calculated. Now, I believe that ABS does its best effort to calculate according to what the government says it has to calculate. ABS are very scrupulously honest, but governments have dealt with the cost of living indexes, which are known as the A series, the C series, the C modified series, the interim retail price, the retail price, and then the consumer price in very different ways. So rent is currently excluded from the consumer price index, but it was included in the A series index in 1912, back calculated to 1901. The other thing that I'm going to quote to you is from measuringworth.com, which is in fact Diane Hutchinson's 5 ways to compute the relative value of Australian values, 1789 to present, Measuring Worth 2012. And I've read the guts of Diane's paper, and it's very good work, within the limits of what indices the government tells Australian Bureau of Statistics or its precursors to put together. But 7 shillings in 1907 is today, in 1965, the last pre-decimal year, 7 shillings of unskilled wages using the National Minimum Award Wage series was £2.11 and 5, which is 2 by 20 is 40, 51 and a half shillings. So from 7 shillings to 51 and a half shillings by the wage index, right? How much did prices go up? Prices didn't go up as fast as wages in dollar terms. I think in hours of labour they went up fairly fast, but we don't have that Marxist data, so we have to rely on another measure I'm going to talk about. Prices only went up to £1.14 instead of £2.11, i.e. £1.14 shillings. What did capital grow at? Well, I think that the best way of considering capital in this measure is the per capita GDP, which again is not a pure measure of capital, but it's a much better marker of how much capital expanded. Capital expanded from 7 shillings to £4.10. Real wages, to my opinion, decreased by half in the period under question in value terms. 410 is 4 by 20 is 80 is 90 shillings. So 7 shillings for the boss increased to 90 shillings. 7 shillings for the worker increased to, 50 shillings of wages. And 7 shillings worth of goods that an ordinary worker would buy only increased to, 34 shillings under the price index. Let's deal with it briefly from 1907, and if I can get my computer to work, there we go, from 1907 to 2010. Now, they have to revise these stats because they're complexly calculated, so that's why I'm using 2010 instead of 2013. Okay, 7 shillings in this index is the equivalent of 70 cents, more or less. In dollar terms, 7 shillings, 70 cents, okay? 70 cents for the unskilled worker increased to $95. That sounds all right. Kind of. It's not what the minimum wage is at. 70 cents in buying lollies or beer or rent. Oops, can't talk about rent, not included into the CPI. Thank you, governments. 70 cents increased to $39.80. Okay? So again, the cost of commodities has increased less fast than the wage rates. But that isn't how we should think about it in terms of class-conscious workers and what we want for our work, because our work is a share of capitalism. And that's why we're going to use per capita GDP to talk about productivity. 70 cents for the capitalist increased to $260, 1907 to 2010. Twice as fast as wages. So, look, I want to leave you on an upbeat note because I always try to. Wage determination lasted until 1967 with the basic skilled margin sense, and in terms of people getting their wages adjusted for the cost of living, it lasted up until about 1987 or the mid-90s in some areas. For something like 70 years, we forced the boss into a situation where he had to keep our wages increasing with the cost of living more or less, and when we fought, we won even more. Over the course of 70 years, we won equal pay for work of equal value. We didn't win equal pay. We won equal pay for work of equal value, which still leaves the boss's slide out. Oh, librarians aren't as worth as much as other professionals. I'd like to go even further with equal pay. For workers, what differentiates a librarian from a childcare worker or a worker working for Ernie's, apart from the fact that they're almost always on the boss's side as human individuals, but a worker working for Ernie's or a standard lecturer in a university who finally gets to work when they hit 40, from a person on the dole or another unskilled worker. And the other big win I'd like to talk about, which the union movement won, we got them to treat Aboriginal workers like any other worker for the purposes of wage determination. Now, okay, so that's a dodgy win, but even for the purposes of wage determination. Okay, so thanks, and I think we should move into discussion, and sorry for being 35 minutes.
Thank you, Sam.